There are rules in baseball that everyone knows. And then there are lines. Unwritten, unofficial, unspoken, but understood by every single person who has ever worn a professional uniform. Lines that separate competition from something darker. Lines that separate playing hard from playing dirty. Lines that, when crossed, do not just spark arguments or bench-clearing moments. They spark consequences. What happened on that field was not a baseball play gone wrong. It was not a collision born from competitive intensity or a slide that got out of hand in the heat of the moment. What happened, what Kazuma Okamoto would later stand up and expose for the entire world to see, was something that had been planned. Something that had been discussed, agreed upon, and executed with deliberate intention. A conspiracy. Targeting one man. Shohei Ohtani. And when it came to light, when the truth of what had been organized against him was pulled out of the shadows and placed in front of the umpires, the league, and every camera pointed at that stadium, the response was not a warning. It was not a fine. It was not a quiet conversation behind closed doors. It was a suspension. 1 month. 3 players. Gone. And before any of that, before the emergency meeting, before the suspensions, before Guerrero Jr. stood in front of a microphone and made a confession that nobody in that room was prepared to hear, there were 5 minutes on that field that people who were present will never forget. 5 minutes of chaos. 5 minutes of 2 dugouts emptying, of voices raised, of the kind of confrontation that stops a game and starts a conversation that runs for weeks afterward. 5 minutes that changed everything. Today we go inside all of it. The brawl. The conspiracy. The emergency meeting. The suspensions. Okamoto's explosive revelation. And the confession from Guerrero Jr. that turned a story about a brawl into something much larger, a story about what happens when the most powerful player in baseball becomes a target, and what happens to the people who thought they could get away with it. To understand how an emergency meeting gets called, you need to understand what the umpires witnessed in those 5 minutes. Baseball brawls are not uncommon. They look dramatic on camera, dugouts emptying, coaches running, players grabbing each other in the infield, but most of them are resolved quickly. Most of them are noise. Adrenaline and momentum and the tribal instinct of teammates protecting teammates. They flare up, they get separated, and within minutes the game resumes and everyone pretends it was more significant than it was. This was not that. What the umpires saw in those 5 minutes was different in quality from the beginning. It was different because of what had happened immediately before it. It was different because of who was involved. And it was different because of what was being said, not shouted, not performed for the cameras, but said with the specific clarity of people who had information and were not going to stay quiet about it. The moment Ohtani was fouled, the moment contact was made in a way that went beyond competitive baseball and into something that had no legitimate sporting explanation, the reaction from his teammates was not the standard protective surge of a bench-clearing incident. It was targeted. It was specific. And it told everyone watching that this was not the first time this conversation had been had. Players from both dugouts were on the field within seconds. But instead of the usual pushing and restrained grabbing that characterizes most baseball confrontations, this one had a different energy. There were specific conversations happening. Specific accusations being made. Specific names being said out loud. Umpires moved through the crowd not just to restore order but to listen. Because what was being said in those 5 minutes on that field was information. And information, once heard, cannot be unheard. The game was suspended. The emergency meeting was called. And what came out of that meeting would change the trajectory of the entire story. Here is the moment that transformed this story from a brawl into something historic. Kazuma Okamoto, a man who plays the game with the quiet focus of someone who lets his performance do his talking, stood up and said something that nobody in that room was expecting. He had information. Not rumors. Not second-hand accounts filtered through multiple sources and softened by the process of retelling. Direct, specific, documented information about what had been planned, who had planned it, and why Shohei Ohtani had been the target from the beginning. The conspiracy Okamoto exposed was not complicated in its design. The most effective plans rarely are. What made it shocking was not its sophistication but its deliberateness. The fact that people had sat in a room, had looked at each other, had discussed and agreed and coordinated, and had decided that the way to neutralize Shohei Ohtani was not through preparation or strategy or superior execution on the field. It was through fouling him. Physically. Intentionally. Repeatedly if necessary. Okamoto laid out what he knew with the precision of someone who had been holding this information carefully, waiting for the moment when it needed to be said. He did not embellish. He did not perform outrage. He presented facts the way a person presents facts when they are completely confident in what they know and completely committed to making sure it is heard. The room went quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet that happens not when people have nothing to say, but when people are processing something that has just rearranged their understanding of what they are dealing with. Because this was no longer a story about a brawl. This was a story about a conspiracy. And the conspiracy had a name attached to it. Emergency meetings in Major League Baseball are rare. The machinery of professional sports is designed to absorb conflict and process it through established channels, warnings, fines, standard suspensions issued through the normal league review process. An emergency meeting is a different instrument entirely. It is convened when the normal channels are insufficient. When what has occurred demands immediate collective judgment rather than bureaucratic processing. When the people responsible for the integrity of the game determine that waiting is not an option. The umpires called this meeting because of what they had witnessed on the field and because of what Okamoto had revealed. Two separate streams of information, what they had seen with their own eyes and what they had now been told about the planning behind it, converging into a single, undeniable conclusion. This had been intentional. This had been coordinated. And it had been directed at Shohei Ohtani specifically. Inside that meeting, the conversation was not about whether action would be taken. That question had already been answered by the events on the field and the information Okamoto had provided. The conversation was about what action, at what level, carrying what message. The answer they arrived at was unambiguous. 3 players suspended. 1 month each. This is not a standard punishment. A 1-month suspension in the middle of a baseball season is a significant consequence. It removes players from a meaningful portion of games, it affects rosters and strategies and standings. It is the kind of suspension that leagues reserve for the kind of conduct they want to make absolutely clear they will not tolerate. The message being sent was not subtle. It was not calibrated to be the minimum necessary response. It was calibrated to be completely clear about where the line is, and what happens to people who cross it deliberately, with planning, against a specific target. 3 players. 1 month. No ambiguity. And then Vladimir Guerrero Jr. stood in front of a microphone. There is a version of this moment that most people expected. The version where a player who has been suspended issues a statement written by a team's public relations department that expresses respect for the game, acknowledges the league's decision, and says nothing of substance. The version designed to satisfy the minimum requirement of public response without revealing anything true. Guerrero Jr. did not give that version. What he gave instead, what came out of his mouth in front of those microphones, in front of those cameras, in front of everyone who had gathered because they knew something significant was about to be said, was a confession. Not a legal document. Not a formal admission for the record. But an honest, unscripted acknowledgement of what had happened and why. He confirmed that there had been discussions. That Ohtani had been specifically identified. That the intention had not been clean, competitive baseball but something that existed outside those boundaries. The room processed this in real time. Journalists who had covered baseball for decades looked at each other with an expression that asked whether they had just heard what they thought they had heard. Because confessions of this kind, public, voluntary, specific, do not happen in professional sports. The legal and professional incentives all point in the opposite direction. You deny, you deflect, You let the league's process run its course and say nothing that can be used against you. Guerrero Jr. said something that could be used against him. Which means one of two things. Either he had calculated that honesty was the only path forward given what Okamoto had already revealed, that the conspiracy was already exposed and denial would only compound the damage. Or he said it because somewhere beneath the calculation there was something that needed to be said. Something that had been sitting on him since the moment it was decided and had grown heavier with every passing hour. Either way, the words were said. They were recorded. They were heard. And they confirmed everything Okamoto had exposed. Through all of this, the brawl, the emergency meeting, the suspensions, the exposure, the confession, there was Shohei Ohtani. And here is what is important to understand about how Ohtani moved through these events, because it tells you everything about why targeting him was always going to be a miscalculation. Ohtani did not respond to the foul with retaliation. He did not lead the charge when the benches cleared. He did not stand at the center of the confrontation demanding recognition of what had been done to him. He was present, he was aware, and he was composed in the way that only someone with genuine internal stillness can be composed in a moment of chaos. The people around him responded. His teammates responded. Okamoto responded, with information, with specificity, with the kind of response that ultimately produced far more consequence than anything that could have happened in 5 minutes of field confrontation. But Ohtani himself moved through it the way he moves through everything. With the calm of someone who understands that the most powerful response to being targeted is not noise, but performance. Not retaliation, but continuation. Because here is what conspiracies against Shohei Ohtani always fail to account for: the machine keeps running. The preparation, the discipline, the system that produces home runs on schedule and strikeouts on demand, none of that is disrupted by external interference. None of it is accessible to people who want to knock him off his foundation. You cannot foul a man off his routine. You cannot conspire against a system. They targeted Ohtani. And in doing so, they handed him something more valuable than anything they could have taken: confirmation, delivered in the most public possible way, that what he has built is significant enough to be worth conspiring against. That is not a small thing. The suspensions have been handed down. The emergency meeting has concluded. Guerrero Jr.'s confession has been recorded and replayed across every platform that covers the sport. 3 players are gone for a month. And the story of what happened, what was planned, what was executed, what Okamoto stood up and exposed, what the umpires determined and acted on, is now part of the permanent record of this season. But here is what will outlast all of it. The image of Shohei Ohtani moving through 5 minutes of chaos with the composure of someone who has never once allowed external circumstances to determine his internal state. The image of a player who was targeted by a conspiracy and responded not with chaos of his own, but with the quiet, absolute confidence of someone who knows that the field will eventually say everything that needs to be said. The umpires held their meeting. The league issued its verdicts. Okamoto told the truth. Guerrero Jr. confessed. And Ohtani? Ohtani will show up tomorrow. He will go through his preparation. He will eat what his body needs, work what his body requires, and arrive at the plate carrying a system of readiness that no conspiracy has ever been designed to defeat. Because you can plan against a player. You cannot plan against a standard. And Shohei Ohtani's standard has never once, not for a single day, been something that other people's decisions get to determine. The factory keeps running. No matter what they try to put in front of it.